Thank you everybody for joining on the call today. My name is Margaret Kralt and I'm a member of APPI, working as a professional planner in the Northwest Territories. I currently live in the city of Yellowknife and I've lived here since the fall of 2006. So seen a lot of change in community planning and impacts to the climate and our communities. So we just thought we would take some time today to share a recent a planning project that won an award with APPI, and that's the Tuktoyaktuk Community Plan and Zoning Bylaw. So if you could switch slides.
Yep, 1 second here. There you go.
Perfect. So each year the APPI puts out a call for planning awards. They're looking for planning awards of excellence and planning awards of merit. We were awarded the planning award for merit. Our second slide, the next slide is just looking at the eligibility requirements. In this case, so we're on slide 3. In this case, we won for comprehensive, the comprehensive community planning and policy, and the Tuktoyaktuk Community Plan and Zoning Bylaw was a community plan or a municipal development plan, the equivalent to a municipal development plan in Alberta, and updates to the zoning bylaw for the Hamlet of Tuktoyaktuk. So next slide. So this is Tuktoyaktuk. Tuktoyaktuk is at the top of the NWT. It is along the Arctic Ocean, and it is a traditional Inuvialuit community. So it was first settled as a hunting camp or a seasonal camp by the Inuvialuit people, and slowly over time morphed into a Hudson Bay post and then a formal settled community that is now the Hamlet of Tuktoyaktuk. There are approximately 950.
Oh. Margaret, can you just move closer to your monitor? You're just kind of popping in and out.
Oh, sorry about that. How's this?
Perfect, that's better.
Great. So if you can switch to slide 4, or you're on. Okay, perfect. So Tuktoyaktuk is a traditional Inuvialuit community. I'll just kind of recap what I said. It was originally started as a seasonal hunting camp where people would gather, turned into a Hudson Bay post based on its strategic location on the Arctic Ocean and the natural port that actually exists in the community, and is now a settled community, an all-season settled community in the Northwest Territories with about 950 people, most of whom are still
oh, there you go again. Margaret, we lost you again there.
Oh, sorry. How's this?
If you could get a little closer.
Okay, how's this?
Better.
Okay, great. So maybe we'll go to the next slide, or the video. Is the video next?
Yeah, I can pull up the video. 1 second here. I think. Me 1 second.
The Hamlet of Tuktoyaktuk is a traditional Inuvialuit Arctic community. It has made national and international news because of its vulnerability to the rapidly changing climate. Rising sea levels, longer periods of open, unfrozen water, and stormy weather has increased the rate at which the shoreline of the community is eroding into the Arctic Ocean. This is a threat to community housing, roads, and other infrastructure. To support mitigation efforts, the Hamlet of Tuktoyaktuk recognized the need to develop innovative and strict planning policies to restrict future development in at-risk areas. These policies would also encourage gradual community redevelopment to areas that are not susceptible to climate effects. The planning process was led by the Hamlet with support from Dillon Consulting and was adapted to respect the culture and traditions of the residents. The final planning documents considered and aligned with the Canadian Institute of Planners Policy on Climate Change Planning. Due to the nature of the area, erosion and flooding will always be a risk to the community. A longer-term continued redevelopment approach was considered for their planning policies. The Tuktoyaktuk Community Plan and Zoning Bylaw met all these requirements through a 3-phased approach to redevelopment for both 20-year and 50-year planning horizons. The zoning bylaw supports the implementation of the community plan by using development regulations that aligns with the goals, objectives, and policies of the community plan. It was adopted by Hamlet Council in April 2018. Adoption of the plan supports difficult and unpopular redevelopment decision-making. Following the goals and objectives of the plans, Tuktoyaktuk has managed to secure funding for the safe relocation of their most vulnerable buildings.
Okay,
Great, thanks.
let's pull this back up for you guys. Okay.
Great. Yeah. Okay. So actually, if you want to switch to the next one. So just a little bit of context. The video addressed it a little bit, but Tuktoyaktuk is it sits right on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. The land mass, or the geotechnical ground stability of the area, is mostly delta sand. So it's fine granular soil that typically, if left to its own devices, would spend a lot of time shifting and moving. But because there's a stable, long-term permanent community there, there's been a lot of effort to mitigate how much movement happens with the shoreline and the soil as it is. The community has spent a long time dealing with and addressing and trying to mitigate the erosion that they're seeing along the shoreline. However, because of the increase in changing climate, which includes unpredictable ice conditions, which means there's more seasons where there's less Arctic ice and more open water, the variability of the storm surges, they haven't actually been able to provide any significant mitigation to the shoreline, and all attempts to preserve it have failed. Up until this project and this planning process, there hadn't been a lot of effort paid to actually restricting land uses in certain parts of the community and actually starting to think about a much more aggressive redevelopment process. When we started the community planning process, one particular area that's known locally as the Point, which is the most northern point that sticks out into the ocean, was losing shoreline at a rate that was much faster than anybody had anticipated. And there was actually about 6 or 7 houses that had lost up to 2 or 3 feet of shoreline within a 2-year season. And so the vulnerability of those houses and the susceptibility that they would actually have to move much faster or risk being swept into the ocean were quite a serious concern. So it took a little bit of thinking and some commitment on behalf of the Hamlet to actually start thinking about restricting land uses, and not just restricting it along the shoreline, but also thinking about the whole area, because eventually the shoreline will recede to a point where it's likely going to be all gone. The other thing that was really interesting with this is it's a community that's quite vulnerable to the climate, the elements, the changing climate, but it was also poised to become the last link by all-season road to the Arctic Ocean. So as we were putting this plan together in 2017, the government of Northwest Territories and the federal government were actually developing an all-season road that led to Tuktoyaktuk, which was part of a vision Prime Minister Diefenbaker had in the 60s, 70s to link Canada from coast to coast, and then finally to the last coast, which is the Arctic Ocean. So here we are trying to plan for a community that's really struggling with its vulnerability to the elements, but then also thinking about how we were going to support likely expanded growth and development opportunities that are coming because there's a road that's coming. Can you switch to the next slide? So this is where Tuktoyaktuk, this is a more detailed map of Tuktoyaktuk. You'll see, oh, sorry. Slide, yeah, that one, there we go, thanks. So you'll see this is a map of the Northwest Territories. Tuktoyaktuk is that furthest black dot closest to the ocean. The dots below that are Inuvik and Sigachik, which are also communities that are along the existing all-season road. The Dempster Highway is the highway that had typically connected Inuvik to the Yukon, but the government of Northwest Territories was extending the link between Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk, which is that red section there. that opened in November 2017. So shortly after this plan was actually adopted and put into practice. So it presented, I wouldn't say new challenges, but it added an element to the planning that was going to make it a little more unique and challenging as we proceeded. Can you click to the next slide? So our planning process was initiated by the Hamlet, and what we needed to do was develop a certain approach or an innovative approach that actually started to address some of the physical threats that were becoming more and more prevalent in the community, and particularly as it related to infrastructure. And as I had said earlier, there's like the western shoreline of the point was the biggest concern, but recognizing that as the landscape started to erode, it would continue to erode, and that would put a lot more at risk than just the houses that were directly along that shoreline. So acknowledging the vulnerability to climate change and recognizing that mitigation may not be the answer, and adaptation is probably going to have to be, have a larger presence in the planning process, we started to look for opportunities that would support growth and redevelopment as opposed to trying to save what was there. We also tried to align it with the CIP policy for climate change and informed planning, and added a lot stronger language around the changing climate and what the impacts were for this community as we were starting to develop these policies. And of course, all of this had to be done through an engagement approach that supported the traditional Inuvialuit community. So we had to think a little bit more broadly about how we were actually going to be engaging and drawing out some of the responses from the community to help them really recognize and also apply some of their own knowledge to what we could do from a planning perspective. And I remember sitting with council, and we were talking about redevelopment and having to redevelop, and their mayor at the time said, well, we're pretty comfortable with redevelopment. We know this is part of the landscape. We know this is not a particularly stable landscape suited for permanent development. So we've had to adjust and change and move. So we're prepared for this. And there was quite a bit of support. So it was pretty exciting to actually start to see council recognize that they were really on the crux of having to make bigger, more substantial changes. Next slide. So some of the things that we really incorporated into this process, the NWT's Planning Act requires that people think about, or communities think about planning on a 25-year horizon in order to really bring all of the policies of this plan together and really connect the amount of transition and redevelopment that needed to happen. We actually expanded this to a 50-year horizon. And we linked the assets and the asset management of the different community infrastructure to that horizon and came out with a 3-phased redevelopment approach. So this is quite different than some of the typical formats that we see in our community plan reviews in the Northwest Territories. And incorporating this phased approach linked redevelopment of infrastructure to where and when the community would start to shift away from the most vulnerable locations in the community. But then also recognizing that just redeveloping in one phase likely wasn't enough, because as the shoreline receded and continued to recede in the larger horizon, the redevelopment locations probably wouldn't be suitable in the next 25 years, and they'd have to continue to move more inland away from the shoreline. So as infrastructure is meeting its life end, instead of redeveloping it or finding places within the existing community core to redevelop it, we started identifying new locations that could then act as a new community core and linking that redevelopment together, so that as the school needs to be redeveloped, or the Hamlet office, or the Northern store, all of those elements could be redeveloped in a place that was away from the most vulnerable places, and creating new community cores that were in safer positions that could save and protect this community from complete disaster. One of the unique opportunities that supported the redevelopment was bringing in that new seasonal highway, all-season highway. So as access is being created and access roads are being created because of this all-season highway, it actually opened up new places that could be developed as new development areas, and allowed the community to start thinking a little more holistically about where they're going to redevelop, and not necessarily grow, but redevelop, and how that highway will support that. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, sorry. So here's an kind of the high level picture of the three-phase transferability. So right now you'll see stage one is where in the red box, that is where the existing community is right now. And you'll see that that area that's on the very tip, you can see that kind of hook of a point, and the western shoreline, those are the areas that are at significant risk right now. And when you actually look at the mapping and you overlay the surveyed parcels that have been surveyed over time with the actual land mass that's here right now, it's quite telling to see how much land of original surveyed parcels that had been surveyed in the 1990s, how much of that is actually been swept away already and isn't actually part of the land mass. So the idea is where the community is concentrated right now in stage one would slowly start to shift and move into the area that we see as stage 2, but also recognizing that in a 25-year horizon, stage 2 will likely be at risk, and then identifying that longer 50-year horizon, which might be stage 3, which is bringing it even further back. I suspect that Tuktoyaktuk will always continue to struggle with their land base. Just looking at this map, you'll see there's a lot of water. And if the ground stability is mostly sort of a pebbly sand, you can see it will always be a bit of a challenge. But what this does do is give them some sort of a planning process, or a much longer range planning to think about and connect the three-phase approach to the asset management cycles. So ideally, if we're thinking infrastructure has a 25 to 30-year lifetime, within the next 20 to 35 years, they should be thinking about that redevelopment and what it looks like, so that they are reducing that risk to their infrastructure, and also reducing costs, because they're not having to replace infrastructure that was put in a place where it probably shouldn't have been, given what we know about the vulnerabilities in this community. Next slide. So the results, the community plan process definitely demonstrated there was a leadership by the Hamlet Council to think about and address some of these changes. What happened once the plan was passed, and we didn't necessarily anticipate this at the time, but what happened was they were able to use their planning process and their planning process and policies to link it to secure some disaster mitigation funding. And Chris Hewitt, who's the manager of planning with the Government of Northwest Territories, wasn't able to join me today, but he was involved with the community after the fact, and they were actually able to secure quite a bit of funding to move the vulnerable homes that were on the shoreline to a more secure spot. And they've also, because the redevelopment and the transition will be phased, and it won't be seamless, because houses are being moved away from the shoreline, but to safer spots that are quite a ways from the actual community core itself. They've actually been able to use some of this funding to come up with interim measures to help people move around the community. So there's been a community van that's been hired to help transport people who are living farther away from the community core to some of the services and amenities in the core itself. The zoning is providing more restrictive tools, and it's really helping the council with some of their local decisions, especially when they're experiencing pressures related to development. The area that is the most vulnerable is still a very attractive place to live. It's close to the shoreline. It's easy for boat access and access to the landscape. This is still a traditional community. There's a lot of hunting and fishing and other activities that the community is still practicing. So there is a desire to still live on the point and in the area that's vulnerable. But from a long-term perspective, things really have to shift and move. And so a big part of the zoning bylaw is providing the local council with that restrictive tool to help them make the decisions. And then it's also an opportunity to implement some other goals and objectives of the plan, and connect it to some of the other initiatives that are going on, not just in the community, but broader, larger initiatives that are happening in the Northwest Territories with the government as well. So it's been pretty positive. Yeah, next slide, please. So this is just a news article. If you Google Tuktoyaktuk, lots of stuff will come up because this has been something that people have spent a lot of time looking at, considering and researching. This is a picture that was in a newspaper article this summer. So they're trying to rush us. So this is a very good picture of how close that shoreline how far it's receded and how vulnerable those homes are. And this is a case of a home that has to move, and there's still discussions and things happening as to when and how this happens. So, next slide. So I touched on briefly the results, and one of the positive putting into action results of this plan was some of the disaster mitigation funding. And one of the programs that they actually got federal funding for was the National Disaster Mitigation Program. So it's approved funding that was made available to the territorial government and the Hamlet that allowed them to collect some of this information about the wave action, the ice information, and then develop some of these mitigation options and provide some cost estimates. One of the challenges when we were developing the plan, and one of the concerns, was the homeowners didn't actually have the funds to move their homes. Now, most of the homes in Tuktoyaktuk are not on permanent foundations. They're on stilts or space frame style foundations with trucked services. So they have water tanks, sewer tanks. So actually relocating homes isn't impossible, but the cost to do that is quite expensive. And so one of the things the Hamlet had to grapple with and work with community members on was how are we going to do this when they are vulnerable, and how can we secure the funding? And a big part of this was the community planning process and the choice to actually restrict this. So in 2017, 18, or maybe even 19, I think, they were able to actually secure this funding, and they're in the process of moving 4 homes to more stable ground. And so that's a positive win. That's a very quick win for the planning process, and it shows how it can actually support larger initiatives. Next slide. The only concern and things that they run into is, and you'll see in this picture, that the 4 homes were relocated from what's known as the point locally, which is the area at the top there, and they were relocated to what is known as Reindeer Point, which is 6 kilometers away from the community core. So significant costs to the moving, but there's also the side implications of what does that mean for the homeowners and the residents of those 4 homes if they don't have access to stable transportation or personal vehicles. So in this case, the community had to think beyond just the cost of moving homes and actually think about what that meant from a community accessibility perspective. And so in this case, they were able to secure some additional funding for to hire a van or a taxi, like a community taxi service that does allow for that transportation. However, as they continue through their process, and as they work through trying to continuously relocate their community, they will likely run into more situations where they will not have a community core that is as central and accessible for everybody. So as they continue forward, these are challenges and things that they'll have to keep thinking about. Next slide. So this is just a graphic of some of the houses that they're planning. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Go. Sorry. The one before that. Yeah. Oh, next one. This one. Thanks. Yeah. This is just a picture of the 4 houses that, this is a little more detail, the 4 houses that were actually moved. Just shows you how and where and when they plan to be relocated. I suspect once they're gone, the Beaufort Road that we see there will become a little bit more susceptible as well to the erosion. So all the houses on the other side of that road too will have to eventually start thinking about relocation and what that means and moving forward with that.
Margaret, I just have a question on the line. And so Corey's just asking, what was the budget for the relocation of each house? Just an average price would be fine.
I don't know. This is where Chris Hewitt might have a little bit more information. I would suspect. I wouldn't know. That's a question we could ask. We could definitely ask Chris Hewitt and see if we could send a note back.
Yeah,
no
I'll
less,
take note.
yeah.
Yep. I'll take note and get back to Corey.
Okay. I think given its location in the Arctic, I mean, the all-season road probably helped a little bit because they could actually ship vehicles into the community large enough to move this, but not less than $10,000 if more. So next slide. So again, this is just an overview of Tuktoyaktuk itself. This is the bird's eye view. You can see that it's just an interesting place to try to be. And actually where you see Tuktoyaktuk Island at the top there, that used to be an island that was much bigger and has slowly eroded over time. And if it continues to erode at the rate that it is, once that island is gone, it actually opens up all of this area in below that in the community where you can kind of see the picture. That's where most of the community is, because it's no longer there to take most of the heat from the waves and the ice action. Next slide. So the final products, in order to really be successful, I think we had to be careful with what we put together and how we put it together. So the final planning documents were written in plain language. They were targeted for the audience and the residents, especially where English is a second language. So we had to make sure that the language, the wording was understood by the local community, both the council and those who might be interested in any redevelopment or development activity. It had to be clear and concise, and as much as possible, we had to use visual images to support the plan. So although it was dealing with some pretty complex issues, we had to make sure that it was written to a level that was understood and usable. Next slide. The overall goal of the plan was definitely to develop resilience to climate change. After years and years and years of trying to mitigate, it had to include more aggressive adaptation approaches. However, the concept of a livable community that could support new opportunities also had to be included and thought about. And so a big part of this was linking the planning policies to the asset management process, the capital planning, disaster mitigation, and the economic development opportunities. Which is why we also had to tie in a longer timeline. It wasn't enough to look 25 years in advance. They had to start looking a little bit more broadly to help understand what some of those longer range planning opportunities are. So tying the long range land use policies to the physical redevelopment was really important to actually develop a community that could have some sort of resilience to the climate change, the changing climate. Next slide.
Margaret, I just have another question on the line from
Sure.
So the questions that came in most waterfront communities, the wealthier homes are closer to the shoreline. Was this the case in this project? Or was it longer time residents that needed to be relocated?
Good question. I wouldn't say it certainly wasn't wealthier homes, although because it's in an Inuvialuit community in the high Arctic, the concept of wealthier homes and the land ownership structure and the housing model and how people develop and acquire houses isn't the same in southern communities along shorelines or lakes or waterfront. So we don't see the divide between wealthier homes and less wealthier homes. The primary housing developer in the Northwest Territories, in some of these smaller communities, is the Housing Corporation. So what we did see, though, the Housing Corporation does have some land or housing ownership programs. So there were a few of the houses there that weren't actually units that belonged to the government or the Housing Corporation, but actually had been purchased or had been bought through their home ownership program. So those actually were a little bit more difficult because those were homeowners who were on the hook to move their homes versus the Housing Corp, who has much larger budgets to do that. So no, the short answer is no. It wasn't the wealthier homes, but that's more because of the housing structure and the different sort of models for how housing is developed and exists in our small communities is a little bit different than our southern locations. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's good. We'll move on, and Sean can type in if he has anything to add.
Mm-hmm. So this is just another picture of one of the homes that was at risk, and you can see how close this came. It was kind of incredible. I remember when we first went, we could actually see one of the sewage tanks poking out because the shoreline had eroded so far that it was actually exposed. Next slide. And that pretty much wraps it up. And I guess I'll open it up to questions. So.
Yeah, so guys, let's just take a look here. If you want to type in some questions just to kind of keep a point of order, that would be great. And we'll just give you a couple minutes to see if you had any thoughts for Margaret. You guys can also talk as well if you like, I believe. I've got that turned back on. Okay, so I've just got one question here in from Brendan Smith. Margaret, so Brendan's asking, how many communities face similar challenges in the Northwest Territories? Margaret, do we still have you? Seem to have lost Margaret here. Self-muted. Margaret? Seems to have.
Okay, sorry. Hi, I was muted. Sorry, I'd been muted by the.
Yeah.
So the question is, how many communities are facing similar
Challenges?
things?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say Tuktoyaktuk is by far has the most challenges. There's 33 communities in the Northwest Territories. So it's definitely like to have that much susceptibility to the Arctic Ocean and the changing. So that's a big one. However, a lot of our other communities are along rivers, particularly the Mackenzie River and a few of the others. And so those communities do experience, to a lesser extent, but they are experiencing similar similar issues with erosion, eroding riverbanks. Communities were set up around the river because that was a big part of how they lived their lifestyles. It was a big part of having access to the river and the landscape. So a lot of homes are, or the older parts of the communities are on the riverbank. So we see that. Another community we're working with right now is Sachs Harbor, which is on Banks Island, at the, which is on an island in the Arctic Ocean. And they are also experiencing high levels of erosion right along their shoreline, and will also have policies developed in their new plan that talk about the redevelopment. Tuktoyaktuk is a community of about 900 people. They've got a bit more economic activity happening there, so they will have economic growth. Sachs Harbor's different. It's also an Inuvialuit community, but it's quite small and very isolated. So they will likely have to have redevelopment policies that move a lot of their housing units away from the shoreline into more stable areas, but they're not, they don't have the landscape to the same extent that Tuk has. So I would say many of our communities have some of these issues.
Okay. So I have another question from Ada and Greg in Leduc County. What specific tools were adopted in the bylaw to control development along the shoreline?
We went as far as creating no development zones. So the whole point area, and if you actually go back to slide 15.
Okay.
So
just one second here.
yeah.
Just let me know when you see it.
Yeah, keep going. I think two more. Yeah, this one. Okay. So if you actually look at this, the blue arrow that shows the point, that whole area became was zoned environmentally sensitive lands. So there was no development that is allowed going forward on that area. And this was actually challenged, and Chris Hewitt would be able to speak more to this because he was involved from the GNWT's perspective, but there was questions raised about actually just moving houses to the other side of the shoreline, so moving it away from the susceptible part, but just moving it to the east a little bit. And one of the contingents, like one of the responses was that that's not going to work because eventually the shoreline will catch up. So we actually, so that was one thing, was just creating areas that were not appropriate for development. The other thing we did was we started adding a little bit more analysis into the development permitting process. Because the primary developer for housing in the community is the NWT Housing Corporation, there was buy-in by that organization to start adding more geotechnical analysis into the permitting process and the planning and the housing development process. So looking at landscapes, looking at the shoreline, looking at just the flood risks and some of the geotechnical side of it, and asking the question, is this actually going to be more suitable in the long term, like a 25-year horizon? So that was something, and that was added to the development permit forms. And then the other thing, and it was just on the top of my head and I lost it, how they actually developed foundations, and making sure that when they're actually developing some of the infrastructure, that they're using some of the more advanced technology that is identified in some of the NICE standards, so the Northern Infrastructure Standards, and actually incorporating that into some of the regulations as well, to make sure that any development going forward was suitable for the landscape as well. So
okay. I have another one here. So this is from Natasha. Thanks for the presentation. I wonder if you can explain why a phase 2 was built into the plan as opposed to just moving to full relocation in phase 3.
Phase 2 was added because of the complexity of actually managing how people move around the community. So if we had just gone right to from phase 1, which is where it is now, to phase 3, the cost would be significant because there's still infrastructure and roads that need to be developed to access some of phase 3. But then the logistics of people actually living in the community and making it livable was quite challenging. So if you're taking the store and the school and the Hamlet office and the senior center and whatever, and moving it more than 6 kilometers away from where people are living, that big of a jump was probably too much for the community to handle and to balance that livability of their community. Even the 6 kilometer change from where the housing is being relocated from where it was adds extra costs and challenges for getting people around and making their community accessible. One of the things that we're cognizant of is not everybody has a car and has the ability to afford a car or to move around the community. So we had to really find that fine balance between what was reasonable from a redevelopment perspective to keep the community livable versus the longer term resilience to the climate.
Okay, I have another question here. Is the street, sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Is the street infrastructure owned and managed by the hamlet or the territory? Who is responsible for replacing the roads that are eroded?
It's mostly the hamlet's responsibility to maintain their roads. The structure of the Northwest Territories is that the government of Northwest Territories funds the communities. So the hamlet doesn't actually collect their own taxes. That's done by the territorial government, but they have to add it in and maintain most of the roads within the hamlet boundary. That doesn't include the highway that takes you to the municipality, but all of those roads that are eroding and that they're having issue with is the hamlet's responsibility.
Okay. The next question on the line is, how many communities face similar challenges?
I think did we answer that one already, or?
Maybe in the presentation.
Okay, I thought I had answered that, but that's, I would say there's 33 communities in the Northwest Territories. Tuktoyaktuk is by far one of the worst for these challenges. But what we see is a lot of our communities along the Mackenzie River and along other riverscapes, not so much the lakes to the same extent, but the communities that are along the rivers are facing similar issues with the eroding riverbank and the location of some of the original homes and areas of the community. So I'd say every community in the Northwest Territories is likely facing some issue with the changing climate, but for those, you know, hard to say how many, but I'd say maybe half those that are along moving water bodies.
Okay. Okay, the next one I have is, how did you adopt zoning regulations to suit this type of project?
We had to simplify them. They aren't that much different from your conventional zoning, other than we had to simplify them. We had to build in processes into sort of the application, the zoning application process, to help it be more usable and user-friendly for the municipality. And then we had to work with planning partners like the territorial government and the housing corporation to help to make sure that they were on board with some of these regulations and they were willing to plan and incorporate into their planning some of this redevelopment.
Okay, I'm just trying to consolidate. Some of these are very similar. I'll jump to this one here. Also, how did you or local authorities engage which area residents, businesses, etc., anything unique with regard to visual and verbal communication?
We actually, because this is a community that's, I mean, I would say engagement fatigue about the landscape this is a community that's had a lot of engagement, a lot of discussion around the shoreline and erosion and some of the impacts to the climate change. So we actually made a point of trying to tag this activity onto existing events in the community. We had a local person, that his name's Calvin Pokiak, who was hired to actually work with us and to be our local interpreter or guide or person that helped us. So that was one thing. We hired a local person to help us. Then we ended up they had a music festival called the Land of the Pingos Music Festival. And we actually set up there because we knew a lot of the community would be there and a lot of people would be engaged. So we we had a booth there and at several other community events where people were. And then because we had Calvin to help us, we actually created some prizes or developed some draws and some other things to really encourage people to come talk to us and to actually participate in some of the discussions and fill out the survey. So that gave us an opportunity to actually have some more engaged citizens, because there was benefit and they were interested in participating. And then we actually spent time just going, it's not a large community, so we spent time at people's houses, getting to know them, talking to them, trying to figure out what some of these bigger concerns were. We also did a school visit as well. So we actually sat down with the youth. We had an interactive mapping tool that we used called GeoPlanner. So we actually could use that with residents, the students, and council to sketch out some options for zoning and to start actually thinking about what this would look like. And because we had that tool and we could turn on and off layers, it was web-based, but we were able to turn it on and off layers. We could actually bring in some of the layers that showed the flood risk, that showed the receding shoreline and what it might look like in 25 years. So it was very graphic, very visual, and very hands-on. They could actually start to sketch out their own zoning options and compare it to some of the risks that we actually visually had spatially included in the mapping tool. So.
Okay. So my next question is from Kimberly. And so Kimberly just states, my apologies, I was a bit late and may have missed this, but how strictly do residents view the boundary of the town? Is it felt that relocation can only occur in the boundaries, or is a broader area available? Does this feeling match the actual regulations that apply?
That's interesting. I would say that this is an Inuvialuit community, so a boundary question was a little bit moot because this is their traditional territory, these are their traditional lands. And so understanding their community and their settlement patterns are probably not as bound by boundaries and where the boundaries actually are. There is sort of a land tenure question that came out as part of this, because a lot of the land surrounding where the community is right now is land that's owned by the Inuvialuit Land Administration, which is the organization that represents the land claim for the Inuvialuit people. So there was a bit of there wasn't a lot of concern about the boundary as much as sense of place and people being connected to where their homes are, where they sit on the shore, and how they typically access and move about their community. So not so much a boundary question as much as like a sense of place. This is where we are. This is where this is where my family lives right now and has lived for a long time. And if we can't live here, we're not sure we'll be as comfortable living at Reindeer Point or somewhere else.
Okay, thank you. So this is just kind of jumping back to the roads a little bit. Are the roads also used as utility corridors for water, sewer, electricity? Are planning efforts coordinated between those other agencies?
Well, we don't actually have any buried utilities for water and sewer. It's all truck services. So, so no, not from that perspective, other than, yes, we still need to have access and we need to be able to move trucks around the community, but moving them around is not any different than having the roads for other things. From the utilities for electricity, any new development would require a certain amount of new infrastructure for power poles and things like that. And I believe the power plant, because this is a community that's on diesel generation, I think the power plant sits in between where we see phase 1 and phase 2. So it's kind of in between those two areas right now. So if there was a need to move, that infrastructure eventually would have to move as well, but the ability to access the phase 2 area is coordinated. It would be coordinated, yes.
Okay, and then so it kind of meshes into the next question. Brendan did ask about the utilities, pipes, that sort of thing. But also, do the residents have access to wired and wireless telecommunications?
Yes, I believe so. There is a tower there. And I think all the communities in the Northwest Territories, and this just happened in the last, I would say even less than the last 10 years. They just got cellular service, but yes, they do have access to that.
Okay.
But again, it's through satellite. There's no buried lines.
Okay, thank you. So the next question from Naomi, what were some of the restrictive tools provided to council for development of vulnerable areas? Was it more geotech studies during development of the permit?
Oh, in terms of like information that was available, or just tools built into the zoning bylaw?
I'm not certain. We'll have to give Naomi a chance to clarify that. I can jump to the next question while she chews on that. Does each homeowner own the lot their house is on? How much input does each homeowner have on the specific new location of their house?
So that's a more complicated question. There's only a certain portion of land, and I can't, off the top of my head, I can't recall of fee simple home ownership in the community. A lot of it is still public housing. And there's still the land management structure in the Northwest Territories is a mix of publicly owned land that's leased to the housing corporation or the homeowner, and the fee simple. So I suspect most of the land that was along in the point along the shoreline was actually leased parcels, and the houses were owned by the individuals. And I think of that, only one or two of them were actually owned in fee simple, were actually owned by the owners. So it's a little bit complicated because not all of them are, the land ownership structure is a little bit different. In terms of the engagement for relocating the houses, I suspect there was some involvement and some discussion. How much, I wasn't privy to, and Chris Hewitt might have a little bit more understanding of that. But the land that is in Reindeer Point, where most of these houses ended up, I think were a mix of commissioners, territorial land and fee simple. And so there was probably some discussion on where they ended up and how. But it's not, it's a little more complicated because a lot of the land actually isn't owned by the homeowner.
Okay, thank you.
That's kind of a convoluted answer, but yeah.
Okay, so I'm just gonna bounce back to Naomi, and this is the last question we have in the queue, which is good because we're running out of time here. So the original question was, what were some of the restrictive tools provided to council for development in vulnerable areas? Was it more geotech studies during development permit? So Naomi's clarification, tools built into the zoning bylaw.
Yeah, so really using the zoning and the land, actually identifying the zones that were absolutely not okay for development, regardless of whether or not somebody could identify that it's stable enough for now to build a house. The zoning was a big part of it. So actually the zone boundaries, and then where it was zoned as environmentally sensitive or a no-go zone, the actual regulations within that were very specific. No development here, etc. For areas that have more question, there was building in some geotechnical analysis through the permitting process. And what does that look like? And even using some of the existing studies that are out there on the flooding and some of the other things to use that. But it was really the zones and actually putting strict regulations into the zones to avoid future development, and also reduce the question of potential, because if we had opened up the door and said, you maybe could build here if you can demonstrate that it's safe, that's a bit of a sliding slope as well. And then actually in the development permit process, requiring some more geotechnical analysis if they're actually going to develop. Going back to the point that the biggest residential developer in this community is a public agency, and that's the NWT Housing Corporation. So that did give the Hamlet, it avoids having to have lots of different conversations with different people that are hoping to develop, because it's mostly one agency that's actually developing, and it's in their interest to actually develop the places that have a longer term lifespan and stability.
Okay, Margaret, that's the last question we have in the queue. There's certainly a lot of thank yous for your presentation and how interesting it was. So again, thank you so much. So the thank yous just keep running in. I just have one more question just stuck in here. What was the elevation difference from where the house and the point were moved from to where they are moved to now?
Oh, off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure. You could probably figure it out, but I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
I have to look it up. Yeah, sorry about that. Off the top of my head, I can't think.
No problem. Yeah, so everyone, thank you for popping on to our first webinar and bearing through as I worked with the technology piece on the other end here. And again, Margaret, thank you so much. The thank yous are just flying in. So everybody have a good afternoon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Take care.
You too. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Yeah.
For many days, hello, my dear, skip the dishes will be arriving soon.